Rome fell in 476. Keep this in mind. Let's imagine that you were a Roman living in the suburbs, just out having your own farm during this time, and the barbarians were attacking the inner cities. There was incredible economic chaos. There was a lot of economic inequality and political unrest. I mean, it was an insane time in world history, one of the most important dates ever. But do you think if you were living during that time, you would know the importance of these events? And do you think if you were a Roman that you would know that Rome is falling? Let's take this to the West. What are some incredibly important things that are happening currently today that could mark the end of the Western Empire, the United States Empire? And how would we know that these were the events that led to our demise until it's just marked in the history books? I was reading that even during this time when Rome was technically already fallen, even during the time of 470-ish after death, people were just accustomed to the idea in Rome that Rome's eternal power was going to last forever. They were invincible. They believed that no matter what challenges they faced, they would overcome it because they've done it for centuries.
So, Josh, the question I hear you asking is, if the Romans, the average Roman citizen, right before the fall was unaware that Rome was about to fall and they thought it was truly eternal, are you trying to see if there's any parallels to, let's say, maybe the average American or the average Westerner right now, thinking that the way of life we currently experience will continue on pretty much indefinitely, but in reality, we are right on the precipice of our doom? Is that the question you're trying to ask?
Yeah, and how these incredibly important dates in history are never known at the time. I would argue during COVID, and more importantly, the response to COVID by worldwide governments is going to be one of the most important dates that we will ever live through. I mean, it was almost a unified social experiment across countries worldwide, locking its citizens down, and people were just bending over like a wet dog and just taking it up the ass. Are we going to look back in 50, 100 years and realize that those moments are the start of our doom?
Well, I would say the experiment from the coronavirus is probably still ongoing, but that's the topic for another video. What I would say is, I think the lens I like to think of it is through the fourth turning. And I think that there's an argument to be made that society itself has to reinvent itself, both in the external world and in the internal world. If you read the fourth turning, the external world, when that gets reinvented, that is the fourth turning. And so from the perspective of, is society being pushed right to the edge? Is it being pushed to the breaking point? Does it feel like everything is flying apart? I would agree with all of that. This past week, just for example, we've had Chinese party favors that have floated across the United States. We've had weather balloons. We've shot them down with missiles, and we've had a spout of UFOs, to say nothing of trail derailments and other industrial accidents that have kicked up. Focus that in with a media that seems more dedicated to driving people apart rather than bringing people together. And yeah, you could obviously make an argument that we are kind of reaching the zenith of this time in terms of intensity. That's the bad news. The good news, I would say, from all of this is that, and I said this before, this also means, again, if you start at the fourth turning, we're exactly where we should be. That's not to say we're in a good spot, but we are at the right spot at the right time. And I would also go on to note that our forebearers have been at this spot, although not alive today, have been at this spot. And that is to say, they've been facing an existential threat. And if they do not renew society itself will crumble. And, what did Reagan say, be relegated to 1,000 years of darkness or whatever? So my point from all of this is, yes, I completely agree that the wheels are coming off the wagon. But I would also argue this is the point in time where the wheels are supposed to come off the wagon. And from that all the generations, from the boomers to the zoomers, right, have to kind of pull together and use their generational superpowers to put things back together. And then it will last for another 80 to 100 years, at which point our children, not yet born, will have the privilege of redoing the thing all over again.
I understand what you're saying, but we do not have a big enough test study on the fourth turning. I would like to go back and see how many fourth turnings each empire has lived through. And at what point are they at the end? Do they get 4, 5, 6 fourth turnings? How many generations does it take until an empire falls? I am someone who's actually always optimistic. Just looking back, I remember when I was a kid, we were on a long road trip from Boston to like one of the Carolinas, and we were like 4 or 5 hours into the road trip, and everyone was just hating life. It was like the worst experience ever. But I'm like, hey, we haven't really had any traffic yet. And kind of optimistically saying like it could be much worse. But right now, looking at the situation that we are currently in, I'm optimistic in certain areas, and those areas are, since we are living in such a high information age, the truth is seeping out, and I think more and more people are realizing the faults of government and trying to actively bring down the size of government to a pretty serious degree. I also see a lot of truth being spread pretty much everywhere by a ton of people who see the need to spread truth. And that is something that, because of our technology, we have a very powerful grasp on. But I just see so many counter forces just punching it in the face. And Justin, I always love how you just come back and say, this is where we're supposed to be in the cycle. It's supposed to hurt. And boy, it does. Because when you're looking around in the media, as you were just saying, this crazy, crazy stuff that's going on every single day, it gives a light at the end of the tunnel, I hope. I just hope that we don't look back, or the history books don't look back in 100 years from now and say that this was the mark of the end of the Western Empire.
I think it is both the end and the beginning at the same time. I think it is both. We are at the fourth turning for America, if memory serves. We've talked about the fourth turning. Another author I like, George Friedman, does a really good job of describing, these large 80-year cycles, eerily similar to the fourth turning. So Josh, just a quick recap. The first cycle was, what is America's relationship with Great Britain? That is, we broke away from it. The second relationship was the second fourth turning issue we had to deal with was, what was the relationship of the states to the federal government? That was the Civil War. And the answer to that one is, well, the federal government reigned supreme over the states for all intents and purposes. The third one was, what is the extent that the federal government can intrude into the personal life of Americans? This was the Great Depression, the resolution to the Great Depression and World War II. And so that one was, no, the federal government can intrude pretty much in all areas of private life, commerce, industry, education. That takes us now to the fourth turning. And the crisis, again, that Friedman argues that's going on here, like the big crisis, is what is the federal government's relation to itself? That's the crisis we face right now. And this is very interesting because, in a strange way, for the prior three crises we've had, there was always a third party, in a sense, to kind of rally the troops around. There was always an existential threat. Even in the Civil War, it's North versus South.
Well, maybe those UFOs, Justin.
Maybe UFOs, yeah. Big ones. Anyways. But that takes us to right now. And what's interesting is that, like, both the solution and the problem are within. The evil and the good, I guess you could say, is coming from within. We have to there's another friend that you and I both know, and I was making the argument that it's almost like there was some Russian cat or whatever, or some Russian dude down, I think it was in Antarctica or whatever, and he was a doctor, had some sort of heart issue, and he basically had to have open heart surgery. The problem was, as a doctor, he was the only one who could do open heart surgery, and he had an assistant who was capable, but by no means a surgeon. So what did the Russian do? He basically had to do open heart surgery on himself, conscious, with his assistant, probing in around on all of that. And I think it's kind of the same thing where we're at right now, is where we've got this very impressive system or whatever that we've built, and there are good things and bad things. And to your point too, the good and the bad are now so out of sync where it's becoming untenable. In other words, what we have is both necessary and insufficient at the same time, where the demands that the government, or what people think the federal government can do, I would argue that the federal government can't actually do. And as a result of this, people are going to have this come to Jesus moment, as is the federal government going to have this come to Jesus moment, and realize, okay, well, listen, like, just what is the role that we are supposed to do in society? And again, this is against the backdrop of society at large saying, okay, well, what is the role that we as Americans want to do? Or let's say Western Europeans or the West, just in general. And of course, this dovetails into the rest of the world too. And this is where you can look at, in addition to Friedman, Peter Zions done some interesting work. I'm reading a book right now, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, on that front. But taking this all back to your point though, and this is to the problem of perception. Like, did the Romans actually know that they were living through the end? Well, maybe not. But I would argue that if you're living through any fourth turning, by definition, it's not going to be a pleasant experience. And yes, the road might be fraught with peril, but so is the potential opportunity if we can get this right.
Yeah, I would make the case, let's going back to the Romans, that took generations, especially with how slow everything moved back in the day. The fall of Rome took generations to play out. I mean, truly, it could have taken over 100 years just to get the fruits of the labor that were already sown way back in the day. And where are we in that cycle today? Have we even started it? I would think that what you were just saying is completely on point, Justin, that we are at the perils of where we really have to choose. Are we going to end up like the Roman Empire? Yeah, so if we are at the edge of the cliff, and if we have to choose, I think that we can be optimistic as well as cautious, which way it really goes.
Oh, absolutely. I would say it would be a fool. Only a fool would run up to the edge of the cliff thinking there was no caution, or throwing caution to the wind. But like, it's one of those things where like someone once wrote, who I paid quite a bit of attention to and still do, that only at the edge will people find, or only at the edge of the precipice will people find the will to change.
Yeah,
in other words,
they said that about the Romans too, or any fallen empire. I mean, sometimes they don't. And we have to be completely honest. There is a pretty high chance that we won't. I mean, we can be optimistic, but I don't think that you can say that there is a incredibly high probability. I mean, maybe you put it 80%, but still, I mean, there's still 20% leeway there.
Let me agree and disagree. And I'm not trying to talk about the size of my mouth here, but let me tell you what I mean by this front. I think that America as a whole, and maybe the West, but let me just speak from the American perspective, as that's what I am. I think that if America could be shown, and this is where it gets really interesting from like a psychological standpoint, to be like unified along a common theme, like if there was a common threat that all of America felt at the same time, and it wasn't some BS, nonsensical threat, designed to peddle and push people apart, but there was truly an existential threat that, the people itself decided on and then rose up together. My suspicion is that just as you've seen, because Josh, you were born in the early O's, I was born in the mid 80s. And from my perspective, and probably much more from yours, all we've seen is basically the social fabric being ripped apart for the most part. But I would also argue, just as we've seen it go away, the inverse can also be true in the sense that you can see things brought together. Now you need something to crystallize and bring people together on. A common enemy is generally what's put in this front.
Right now, the media is almost forcing a common enemy on certain countries right now.
Oh, and it's even worse than this. I mean, go back to what Lincoln said when he quoted the Bible, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And the media, shame on them, because they seem to be much more interested in dividing people rather than bringing them together. And it's not just the media, the old school media, but think social media or whatever, right? People fall into tribes, and they it's the name of this channel, confirming your biases. It's a wink and a nod to this, flaw of the human psyche where we like to confirm our own beliefs and ignore everything that doesn't, but whatever, another video. Anyways, my point from all this is that like, I would not underestimate America's capacity to unify, even if such unifications seem preposterous to us right now. But you have to find a common theme to unify people against. And if I know this, and if you know this, surely the elites know this. And so in a sense, I almost feel like you have all this like energy, the psychological energy that's being built up, that's looking for a rallying cry. And if the rallying cry that we adopt as a society and a country is, I would use the word morally good, I think we can restart the system and go into, America, let's say we're in the fourth turning, we'll open the door for the next fifth turning, down time. But if we pick the wrong thing, and this goes back to, the Romans, whatever, right? If we pick the wrong thing to rally against or whatever, right, then yeah, we are doomed. But
yeah, cautiously optimistic. See you guys in a minute.
Yeah.